In this lesson, we'll talk a little bit about transforming our models in 3ds Max. So when you hear someone talking about transforming models, typically we're going to be talking just about moving, rotating, and scaling them around your scene to create the finished look. In this case, we have sort of a living room set, and so we needed to create all of these models and then move them into position to create the finished look. So let's go ahead and import a file. This is lesson 05 start, by the way. And we want to go ahead and import one of the chairs from earlier, so we can choose under the export folder either the FBX or the OBJ, and we'll open that up. Import that into our scene, making sure that it's on a layer that we can see. Hit Z to zoom extents on that chair, and you can see that it's right in the middle of our scene, and it's kind of buried in the ground, and it's not really where we want it, so we need to actually move that around. Now, if I take a look at this, and I'll just turn on edge faces, you can see that I can select each individual piece of our chair, and I don't really want to move those as separate pieces. I want to move everything at once. So in order to do that, we can group these pieces together. So if we go into the schematic view, and I'm going to go ahead and turn on hierarchy mode to change how we are able to view our objects here. You can see that this is where we can look at all of our objects, and you can see that everything is all separate. So every part of the chair is a separate piece, and we want to actually group this together. So we can select all of these objects. We'll go to Group and choose Group, and we'll call this something inventive like Chair Group, and then we'll click OK. And there you can see that we now have a group that is the chair, and if I select this, you can see everything follows within in the schematic view, but more importantly, if I were to go ahead and move this, it'll all move together. So to actually move, we can click on this button here, Select and Move. That will bring up our gizmo that we can move around. You can see that there's a Y-axis here, Z-axis, and X-axis. By clicking on any particular axis, we can move it in that direction. Okay. So there's our chair here. And so we want to kind of move it in position, so we can click on the axes and move it around. Okay. We want to move it so it's kind of sitting on the floor. And so we'll grab the Z-axis and move it up till it's sitting right on top of the floor there. Can move it up and down. Okay. If we select in the middle, you can see that I can move those based on the particular plane that we've got highlighted. So looking at this, I've got this plane highlighted here. I can move it around on the XY plane and so forth. So there's a lot of control you can get using the gizmo here. So we'll move it over in the X to put it next to the other chair. Now we need to rotate it. So whereas we could select Move, and the hotkey for Move is going to be W, we could also select Rotate. So if we hit E on our keyboard, we can go to Rotate, or we can click this button here. And you can see that our gizmo changes a little bit. So now we can click on these particular rings to isolate our rotations on that particular axis. Or if we just click in the center here, we can kind of rotate on all axes if that's what we want to do. Okay, I'll just undo that a little, undo that action. So now we can use our hotkeys to move back and forth between moving and rotating to get it into position. Now we can also scale our chair. Let's say we want to make this chair a little bit bigger. Okay, so here is a third gizmo that we can change. And so we have a particular axis. If we want to scale this in a particular axis, we can do that. Typically you'll want to do a uniform scale. And so we can scale this up, and let's see what happens. So you can see that I'm scaling it up, and it's actually bigger, but it's being scaled from this point right in the center. Okay, and let's say that I want to actually scale it from the ground up. Well, we can actually change the pivot point for this group or model, whatever we're working with. So we're going to go over here to the hierarchy panel, and under here there's a rollout called Adjust Pivot. And so I want to only affect the pivot, so I'll select Affect Pivot Only. And now what we can do is modify the pivot either by choosing some of these buttons, or we can just take that pivot and, let's say, just move it down closer to the ground. So now I'm moving that pivot, you can see the object, nothing is happening with the object. So if I now turn off Effect Pivot Only, you can see that the point at which from which I'm scaling has changed. So now if I go to Scale, you can see it's actually changing from the ground, and so it's pretty close. You can see that it's actually, I don't have to do a lot of moving after I do the scaling on that. Okay, and so you can at any time move your pivot point around based on how you want to actually transform your models. Okay, we can also come up here to our move and rotate and scale, and if we right click on these, you can see that we have some absolute world values which we can change. So if we were to go ahead and let's get kind of a wider view of this, you can see these values in the X, Y, and Z. If I were to actually zero those out, that's going to pop it right back kind of where it came from. Okay, take it back to the origin. And so you always have these values to refer to, and it's going to save those values of, you know, how much you've moved it in the Y versus how much you've moved it in the X and so forth. Okay, and then here we have values for absolute world and then also the offset. Okay, and that's just a right click, accessed with a right click. Now under scale, you actually have a few different options that you can use here. So if I click on this, and you can tell by the little check down on the side, this is select in uniform scale. We can also choose this one, and this is select in non-uniform scale. Okay, so we can scale that non-uniformly. Okay, and then we also have select and squash, which will give you a little bit different result here based on how you click and drag that. Okay, so you have a couple of different options. That's not the only one, but a lot of times that's going to be the one you want to use if you just want to scale something up, make it a little bit bigger. Okay, so that's a quick look at working with pivots and also transforming your model using move and rotate and scale. Keep in mind you can also access those via hotkeys W, E, and R for scale. Okay, and then the gizmos you can manipulate as well. You can do it based on a particular plane or based on a particular axis or just uniformly in general. Okay, so that's how we can transform the models in our 3D scenes. The next thing that we want to talk a little bit about is actually get into the sub-objects of our models. So you see all the models in here. Up to this point, we've just kind of looked at the primitive shapes that we can create, but in order to get more complex shapes like some of the ones that we see in here, and even things like cars and characters and things like that, you're going to have to modify the sub-objects of our different geometry types. So we need to know what those are and how we can manipulate those. So we'll start to look at those in the next lesson.